Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this day. We're pleased to have you with us. I am Tim Durst, partner in charge for the Dallas office of Baker Botts. We're delighted to have so many friends with us in the audience today, and we're privileged to be joined by 6 distinguished guest speakers. We really appreciate you making these next couple of hours a part of your day. I know your schedules are busy and it's hard to set aside time, particularly in these unusual this unusual period that we're in. I think we're not going to disappoint you this morning. This morning marks the 3rd annual session of our Directors Forum. We invite directors and officers and legal executives to join us in an exchange of ideas and discussion on current topics that are relevant to governance and also management issues. Our firm is in a rhythm of hosting a forum every 6 months, once a year in Dallas, and then set apart by 6 months, once a year in Houston. We have a great lineup for you this morning. You'll hear from one of the country's leading economic thought leaders, Richard Fisher. And you'll hear from perhaps the most prominent investor analytics and solutions group, ISS, through their head of U.S. research, Mark Goldstein. And finally, you'll join in a panel discussion with 4 influential North Texas and national corporate leaders, Elaine Agather, Elena Brooks, Ron McCray, and Michael Nicholas. I'm happy that you'll hear from some of my partners along the way as well. We've convened these last 3 years in the awesome facilities at Old Parkland in Dallas. And many of our speakers are back there this morning. We're in the debate chamber again, like in years past, and this chamber sets a perfect stage for open discussion, innovative thinking, and challenging calls to action. We're determined to engage you intellectually, even though we can't engage with you person to person. I think we'll be back in there next year, and we look forward to seeing many of you in person. For this year, of course, mostly virtual, I encourage you to engage with our presenters. In your interface, you should see the video feed for the presentation where hopefully I'm appearing on your screen right now, likely on the left side. And there'll be a chat feature on the right side. This program works best if we can hear from you. Send us your thoughts and questions as we go through the presentations this morning, and each one of our sessions will be all the more productive for it. This year we have something new. We're pleased to have NACD as a new partner for our event. Margot Carter, an executive committee member of the North Texas chapter of the NACD, worked with us on this partnership. Many of you know Margot. She seems to be everywhere, even in these virtual times, as she serves on several boards, is an entrepreneur, an influencer, and one of the very best connectors I know. Baker Botts and NACD have worked together in other markets too. This forum fits hand in glove with their mission, which includes creating forums for peer interaction, enhancing director effectiveness, and being an information source for boards and directors on traditional and cutting-edge issues. Thanks to NACD and to Margot for her partnership with us. This event and the focus of what we'll be doing this morning flow from the core of what we do at Baker Botts. For 180 years, our lawyers have been close advisors, counselors, and strategic partners with business leaders in Texas and across the country. Here in North Texas, we're stocked with some of the best legal talent to be found in one place. From corporate, tax, finance, and other transactional lawyers to IP lawyers to trial lawyers, we're working across a mix of industries as diverse as our North Texas economy to provide value-added, critical path advice to the best companies, large and small, established and emerging, and evolving as our times and our economy changes as well. Let's move along now to the substance of the day. Again, I encourage you to engage with us through comments and questions by using your chat feature. And once more, on behalf of my partners at Baker Botts, thanks for making the time to be with us. Turn it over to David Emmons.
Good morning. Good morning, Richard. We are privileged to have with us today to share his thoughts our keynote speaker, Richard W. Fisher. You've seen Richard's bio, I'm sure, in a shorter version ought to appear at the bottom of your screen together with a headshot that probably when you were 26 years old. So I'm not going to bore you by reading through that, but I did want to point out a few things that indicate, to me at least, the relevance of Richard, his background, and his remarks to this forum. First of all, though Richard has devoted a substantial portion of his career to public and sort of semi-public service, he's also been a successful businessman. He started out at Brown Brothers Harriman, and he formed and ran for 10 years and sold a successful hedge fund. And he's currently an active senior advisor at Barclays, which I think many of you know is the largest bank in Great Britain and one of the preeminent investment banks in the world. Second, Richard's a pretty smart guy. He got a degree in economics from Harvard and an MBA from Stanford, and some other things along the way too. Third, he serves on the boards of some prominent public companies, PepsiCo, Tenet Healthcare, and AT&T. He's got a lot of time and service in the boardroom, and I think that'll be interesting. Finally, I think his public service experience gives him some unique insight into some issues that all public companies are facing today. He worked with multiple presidential administrations, including the Clinton administration, where he spent 4 years as a deputy trade representative with the rank of ambassador. That 4 years included, I understand, 48 international trips, the implementation of NAFTA, and the accession of Taiwan and China to the WTO. You may regret that, but we'll hear about that later. He served also, as most of you know, as the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas for 15 years until 2015. During that tenure, of course, we went through the Great Recession of 07 or 08 or 09. He's currently on Mayor Johnson's task force for, I guess, post-COVID economic recovery. He chairs that, and he's on Governor Abbott's task force for the strike force to open Texas. So all these things are relevant. And by the way, he's also a senior contributing editor to CNBC. So he's got a lot to say, a lot of information. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Richard and we'll get some of that.
All right. Thank you. We're in this great hall here, and we're surrounded by quotations from Cicero and Thucydides and Shakespeare and the Bible. I'm going to reference this speech to one of my favorite philosophers, a country western singer named Justin Moore. And I think it's appropriate because my favorite song of his is titled, "You Look Like I Need a Drink." And there is a wonderful phrase in there. I could tell by the way you looked that there was something different this time. There's a lot different this time, and talk about the differences, and then I want to talk about what it means for corporate management. The obvious things that are very different this time, we start with the COVID. COVID has, of course, shut down our economy. We're trying to reopen it. We're especially working hard in the state of Texas with Governor Abbott. We just had another meeting with him, our group that's advising him on this week. I expect some further action to be taken, but what we've learned is that when you shut down an economy, as has happened in this state and across the country, you destroy that economy, and you destroy the most important function with that economy, which is job creation. One thing I learned in my 10 years at the Federal Reserve is with all the fancy formulas we had and all the dynamic stochastic modeling and the largest economic model in the world of the United States, which is called FERBUS, Federal Reserve Model for the United States Economy, is it all came down to what I was taught in 10th grade economics, if they still teach 10th grade economics in the United States, and that was the economy is a function of C plus I plus G plus or minus X. If you understand that, you understand how the economy works. C is consumption. That's over 72% of the US economy. I is investment. G is government. And then plus or minus X is net exports. And what drives us is consumption. As I said earlier, it's over 70% of the US economy, about 72%. And if you don't have a job, you can't consume. So when we shut down the economy, that's why we had this tremendous reversal in GNP. And that's why it's slowly coming back up as the economy gets opened, the economy gets restructured, and people are put back to work. And we're just trying to see how much further this can go right now. We had a little bit of a pause. If you looked at the data that was released this morning in retail sales for August, that would be likely because of the government's programs, which have been tied up in Congress now after that first surge that was given. That's the G factor, but it certainly had helped restore retail sales while people were getting back to work, but we have a long way to go. I think that's a fairly known unknown right now in terms of what's affecting us. What's also affecting us, of course, is this tassel over what's likely to come out of this presidential election. I am nonpartisan. The best thing about going to the Federal Reserve is you check your politics at the door. You're not allowed to give money to any politician. It saves you a fortune, by the way, by being a president of a Federal Reserve Bank or being on the board, a board of governors. And I've divorced myself from partisan politics starting in 2005. The only thing I would observe is the following. The one thing that I don't think economists have properly quantified is the power of the reversal in the regulatory environment that came in with this administration and the way the Senate of the United States in particular has taken advantage of it. If you look at the NFIB surveys, the National Federation of Independent Business, these are the businesses that create jobs in America. They hold 50% of the current employment. They create about 80 to 82% of all new jobs in the United States. These are women and men that run and build small businesses that are then acquired by larger companies and then rationalized, but that's where the jobs are created. Non-listed companies don't trade on the exchanges. They're the backbone of the U.S. economy, and actually if you add their output together, it's the third largest economy in the world if it were a separate country. Almost immediately after the Trump election, you saw a reversal in their attitudes. They had gone from complaining about overregulation as the Federal Register expanded asymptotically, and they began to focus more and more on finding qualified workers, feeling the relief of deregulation. It's my personal belief that that was much more powerful than the tax initiatives later put through by the administration and the U.S. Senate in terms of providing the wherewithal to bring unemployment down way below what we thought was possible at the Federal Reserve. When I left in 2015 and stepped off the Open Market Committee, we thought 6% would be full employment. And of course, we got down to 3.4%. We also got every demographic group down. It's my firm belief that a different emphasis on regulation, taking regulations off the book before you add more, was the principal driver of that economic expansion, in addition to monetary policy, which I'll get to in just a minute. So I think what's at stake here is what will be the new regulatory regime. If the president's elected, how will he proceed? If he's defeated by Vice President Biden, how will he proceed? And we all know that Vice President Biden has announced further tax increases on corporations and on individuals making more than $400,000 a year. So that should provide a little setback to the economy. We'll have to see how the further expending the expenditures of the government, which is what I'm told, over $5 trillion under his program over the next several years, would offset that, and then how that readjusts the production function of the economy. So that is another unknown. I want to talk about monetary policy for a minute. It's not as much an unknown. The question is the effect of what they're doing known? The balance sheet of the Fed has expanded to $7 trillion now, a little over $7 trillion. If you look at the system open market account, you'll see that well over 6+ of that is held in U.S. Treasury securities, about 4.6 or 4.3, and the remainder in mortgage-backed securities. That hasn't grown very much. Originally, we wanted to get rid of all mortgage-backed holdings because we were distorting what's known as price discovery in the marketplace. But in the meanwhile, it has not been reduced. These are typically longer duration instruments, very hard on the amortization and hard to get rid of. And the Fed doesn't sell things. The Fed holds things to maturity. And that way they don't have to mark the portfolio to market. So the balance sheet has expanded by up to $7 trillion, got down to well under 5, and that will continue for quite some time. Interest rates are at 0, and real interest rates across the board are slightly negative. The signal this sends to an investor is that you can discount the present value of future cash flows literally to infinity. And this is what we tried to do in 2009. Let me just remind you that the markets were under enormous pressure. The economy was exploding inward. We felt under Ben Bernanke that it was necessary to lift the markets so they could function again. Every market known to the financial community had failed. Counterparty trust dissipated, whether it was money market funds, commercial paper, of course, the equity bond markets, and so on. And so we stepped in size. We cut rates to zero, and then we made it clear that we were going to embark on rounds of quantitative easing that would hammer down the yield curve for as long as the eye could see. And lo and behold, after just expanding the balance sheet to about 1.75 trillion from roughly 800 billion where it was before we got started, on the first week of March, the market exploded. We had reached that $1.75 trillion mark on February 23rd of 2009. And the first week of March, the S&P bottomed at 666, what we call the Book of Revelations moment, the devil's number. It turned and has been running ever since. The problem has been that the Fed has not cut back. It has kept rates too low for too long. Even Jay Powell, Chairman Powell now, in his first meeting of June of 2012, warned the committee that we would create a trap for ourselves if we kept this on for too long. And we'd be interfering with price discovery in the equity markets as well. Well, the math was pretty simple. It worked. But again, that tool has not been taken off the table. And it is of questionable efficacy. It hasn't worked in Japan. It hasn't worked in Europe, where they've gone to negative interest rates. The one thing I could tell you is the Fed will not go to negative interest rates. It would destroy the banking system in the United States. It would destroy the money market mutual fund market. And the way our economy is geared, it just wouldn't work. And very importantly, it has failed in Europe. It didn't lift before COVID, was not lifting their economy. They've dug deeper and deeper holes. And Japan, where they've gone to yield curve control, just nailing down the 10-year rate, for example, has also failed to lift the economy significantly. Those tools now I don't think will be used by the Federal Reserve. They're going to rely on standard old-fashioned tools. They recently issued a better definition of how they plan to act as they approach the 2% intermediate term target, which Ben Bernanke set with our committee. That is a controversial target. Paul Volcker, for example, and some of the committee, including myself, argued that the Federal Reserve Act talked about price stability, which means zero, not 2%. And if you look at 2%, it reduces the purchasing power of anybody in 25 years completely. So I don't think that's going to change. I do believe the Fed will keep on accommodative monetary policy. The special programs that the Congress has given them the powers to put forward into the system, the Main Street Lending Program, the PPP program, et cetera, have not been successful. You go back to the very blunt tools that the Fed has. And this is why Jay Powell has been calling for the Congress and fiscal authorities to do their job and not totally depend on the central bank. I found in my 10 years there, it's very easy for Congress people to point their fingers at somebody else rather than get things done themselves. And we were the whipping boy for a long time. Now the Fed is sort of the hope of the country, but it's an unfair burden that's being placed on the central bank, and there are limits to its power. That said, there's one more uncertainty in the system, and that is my old bailiwick, which is trade, and what's likely to happen particularly on the key trade issue of our time, which is China. Our country was absorbed between 2003 and 2013, that is 2003 and 2013, with our efforts in the Middle East. Those seem to have been dealt with successfully thus far. We'll see how the agreement reached yesterday and announced in the papers this morning will take away some of those pressures. Of course, we're withdrawing our troops from most of the Middle East. There are agreements that have been made with some of the difficult powers there. And now the rotation, as we've seen during the campaign and also in the corporate community, has been towards China. This is going to be a very difficult thing that I don't believe will be resolved in short term. And we have to be careful how we conduct ourselves with China. As was pointed out by my introducer, I did do the protocols for China's accession to the WTO. It's a beautiful document. I would have to say that on every one of the items, China has cheated and denied the United States its rightful way for dealing with the Bretton Woods institutions, in this case, the World Trade Organization. All those institutions need to change. The president's right on that front. Whether you like or dislike, as I dislike, the mannerism in which he attacks them, he's right. These institutions were built to reconstruct Europe after the war. The IBRD, the World Bank, is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was to reconstruct and develop Europe. And the last time I looked, Germany was reconstructed and was doing pretty well. as was France and other European countries. So those are going to have to change, whether it's a Biden administration or whether it is a new Trump administration, and they're going to have to be dealt with to configure what really is the new power challenging us, with is China. As you know, we have to deal with them on the technological front. If they capture the digital space and dominate it, that will be a major source of decline for the United States economy. But we have to deal with them by being smart, not by going to war, not even cyber war. Let me just read you a quote that I find from the greatest China expert of all time, Napoleon Bonaparte, of all people, because he had sent so many delegations there and had the best knowledge of China. He did not say, as is attributed to him, let China sleep, for when she awakens, she'll shake the world. That was actually a script writer for a movie by David Niven called 55 Days in Peking, where he played an ambassador, and it was made up. But here's what Napoleon did say, and I quote, "It'd be the worst thing you could have done for a number of years to go to war with an immense empire like China and possessing so many resources. You would doubtless at first succeed, take what vessels they have, destroy their trade." Remember, this is Napoleon Bonaparte, so this is the 18th century. "But you would teach them their own strength. They would be compelled to adopt measures to defend themselves against you. They would consider and say, we must try to make ourselves equal to this nation. Why should we suffer people so far away to do as they please with us? We must build ships. We must put guns into them. We must render ourselves equal to them. They would," continued the emperor, "get artificers and shipbuilders from France and America, even from London, that would build a fleet and in the course of time defeat us. Now great commercial advantage may be lost to England, and perhaps a war with China be the consequences. If I were an Englishman," he said, remember, they were the power at the time, "I should esteem the man who advised a war with China to be the greatest enemy to my country, the greatest enemy in existence. You would end up being beaten, and perhaps a revolution in India would follow. You ought to monopolize the whole China trade to yourselves instead of going to war with the Chinese." I think that's wise advice, even though it was uttered in the 18th century. Because having dealt with China as long as I have, I've been going to China since 1948. You can do the math. I'm only 71, so how's that possible? That's because Mao chased my mother and father out on the last ship to leave the port of Shanghai before he closed the port, the SS President Wilson, and I was delivered 4 months later in California. So I was manufactured in China. I was made in China. And I've been involved originally, thanks to the gift that President Carter gave me with the negotiations. I sat by Secretary Blumenthal's side when he negotiated with Deng Xiaoping to settle our counterclaims against each other in 1979, and 20 years later, working with Charlene Barshevsky and the Clinton administration to get China and also Taiwan 1 minute later into the WTO. And I've invested there, and I've spent a lot of time in China. I don't claim to be an expert on it. I'm certainly not as insightful as Napoleon Bonaparte, but I agree with his synopsis. We're just going to have to beat him. And we have to make sure who's going to be ahead of the race in the digital space. If you look at their education system right now, when we were there in 1979, there were less than 1 million students in schools of all grades in China. And there were only 1,000 cars in the entire country. Now look at the biggest car market in the world. And their students are learning science, engineering, mathematics, et cetera. We are graduating people from our public school systems that can't read or write. And even some of our junior and regular colleges that really can't read or write properly. So this is the challenge facing us right now. It'll be interesting how the new administration goes about it. I want to just mention a couple of things vis COVID and how it's affected at least the boards that I serve on and the CFOs of those companies, AT&T, PepsiCo, Tenet Healthcare, and 1 or 2 private companies. We are going through a change in the production function of the US economy. It's accelerated faster than people were planning for. Just take the drive to get 5G up and running, and later it'll be 6G, and the precision which that provides for artificial intelligence, remote operations, self-driving cars, et cetera. We must get that up and running. The problem is we have to operate at a profit. China operates as a loss leader. They don't have a profit incentive. They use their state-owned enterprises and the subsidiaries of those state-owned enterprises to invade and invest in new fields where they want to, as Lenin said, control the commanding heights in the key strategic areas all over the world. The average state-owned enterprise now has over 15,000 subsidiaries. we don't even know how to identify them as being Chinese or not Chinese. They're clever investors, and they're using it particularly not because of the commodity space, but because of the technology space and the biospace. How do they get significant share in each of those markets, in addition to controlling the ports of Djibouti and the big port in Greece, for example, and the Belt and Road Initiative, and building that kind of infrastructure? This is the challenge for our country, and it will depend on whether or not we have an administration that understands it, A, and B, whether or not we can continue to grow our economy, create the jobs we need, move it forward into this new cyber world in which we live of remote communication and restructuring, and make that much more efficient. I'm actually quite optimistic on that front. I do believe that we have a great entrepreneurial culture in this country. We've been counted out before. Remember, Japan is number one, and then it was Europe is going to surpass us. Didn't happen. And the real issue now is, can we properly compete with China? Not go to war with China, but properly compete with China in order to not allow them to catch and capture the digital future. And I think that is the challenge before us presently. With regard to the companies that you all serve on the boards of or that you operate, this is a good time to strengthen your balance sheets and prepare for the future. Obviously, with these very low interest rates, both here and if you have access to the European and other markets, it's a time to stretch out your debt towers, push your debt burden out further and further, and really take advantage of the fact that markets are accommodative, in the fixed income space in particular. The dollar is still something precious. I was in Australia at the beginning of March. I was sent down there by my colleagues at Barclays to meet with the big banks and the big mining companies in the West, also with the C-suite and CEO and chairman of Qantas. Two things were being done the first week of March when this whole COVID thing and fear began to grip the world. They were stockpiling two things. One was toilet paper, and the other was U.S. Treasuries. And the world still turns to dollars in a moment of fear. The dollar is off about 3.5% year to date. It rallied up significantly in March. It's not that far off from where it was before then, maybe a couple points. But the 10-year Treasury is still the key marker bond for the key currency in the world, appreciated everywhere. And let me just give you a reference point. In over 820 years of history, since Genoa and Venice issued the first 5-year trading paper, this is during the plague, these are the lowest interest rates, according to the Bank of England, for the key currency, key bond in the world. Genoa, Venice, the Dutch, the Spaniards, the Germans, the Brits, and the United States. The 10-year Treasury trades at the lowest interest rate in 800 plus years of history. Take advantage of it. I'd take advantage as much as I can, push out your balance sheet liabilities. Even the spreads with less than investment grade paper are still narrow. These are the things that I think corporations should be taking advantage of right now. So those would be my introductory comments for what they're worth. I hope that's helpful to the audience that I hope is listening to us and to the massive audience we have in this beautiful debating hall here today. Thank you very much.
Right, and with that, we'll do a little bit of Q&A, and some of these questions have come in while you've been talking. So we'll see what the response is from the audience to your remarks. But we'll start out with what you spent a little bit of time talking about there is the low interest rate. And one of our guests has said that, and you also talked about the Federal Reserve liquidity program and the trillions of dollars have been added to their balance sheet recently. Those two things together have apparently created what this person believes is a bubble in equity markets. Is that going to end badly, or is there a way around that?
Well, first, let me say, I'm going to give you my own opinion, not Barclays' opinion, because I will tell you what I tell Barclays senior management in London and New York. And that is that you have to remember, price is what you pay, value is what you get. And right now, the multiples paid for underlying value are very high. The bullish sentiment on Wall Street, measured by any index, whether it's Citi's or Bloomberg or whoever it may be, is at near record heights. If you took a straight line from 1915 through today on publicly traded securities and took the trend, we're over 2 standard deviations above the trend, about 7% over. even after the turbulence of the last few days. So that would tell you that things are richly priced. Again, remember, if you take rates to zero, or you keep indicating the direction is down, which the Fed would like to convey, that allows you to discount the present value of future cash flows to incredible levels. When we took it zero, that meant you could literally discount the present value of future cash flows to infinity. That's the math. I remember Ben walking us through that in the committee because he had just an incredibly supple mathematical mind. So the question is, how long do you rely on the Fed? And then there's also this question, which unfortunately I think we set in place under Ben Bernanke. I voted against QE3, by the way, just for the record. But it was that there was a Bernanke put. Remember, 2013, the markets got when we said we're going to maybe push back on this, reel it back in, and the markets went berserk. And that's where they were convinced that there was a Bernanke put. Janet Yellen and her committee didn't do much to change that. And now, given the action that's been taken, it is interpreted by the market that there's a Powell put. The question is, who determines longer-term interest rates? And that's why I believe the Fed knows the markets do that, not necessarily a Fed per se, say beyond 3 years and out. The 10-year is the key marker bond. And that's being pushed around by the markets because we let so much money out of the bag and lost control from what used to be the commercial banking system. And we'll have to see how those rates react as we expand our balance sheet of the United States, borrow more and more. If Vice President Biden gets elected, wants to go even further than what this president's done, which is leverage the heck out of the balance sheet, how long will the markets tolerate that? And I think part of the answer, this is a long answer to your question, is what's the alternative to the dollar? Well, there's only one, the euro, in size. And there's still doubt about the validity or sanctity or permanence of the European experiment.
Right.
As long as that's the case, we're taking advantage of it. But to get to the ultimate question here, at some point, that train stops.
Right.
I have no idea when that is.
Come on. You talked a lot about China, and you mentioned that you agreed with or understood President Trump's sort of harder line on China. If you're on a board, and I don't want to have any relationship to your current board seats, but you're on a board that says, hey, we've got a great business here, but we're not in China. We should get into China with our business. Now there's some variables around what they do, but they've got some technology. They want to get to China. What would your reaction to that be as a director?
Well, first of all, if you're going to do that, you better get used to having a party official sit in all your management meetings, in your local board meetings, and reporting back to the CCP, the Central Committee, what is discussed in your meetings. You should be prepared for using the kind of tools like TikTok that they want you to use to communicate internally, or the Alibaba and other tools, and whether or not that is safe or not. And you have to be fully aware that there are at least 2 Red Army divisions that do nothing but try to purloin intellectual property. So go in there with your eyes open. It is a huge market. Obviously, for PepsiCo, for example, it's a mega market.
Right.
For the movie industry, you just saw, they just released the numbers. They're up to 90% of the viewership as they were last summer at this time. It's huge for them. Whether Mulan or not has been filmed in certain parts of China, or they have to take this or that out and censor it. And I do think you have to be aware that your corporate communications will be tapped into and that you will be censored. And you could easily be thrown out, depending on how they want to retaliate against what we may do, for example, with certain companies that are operating here from China. So it's an uncertain place. It's a huge market.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I would say is they're not burdened by old infrastructure, credit cards, copper wires. They've skipped an entire technological, this is Xi Jinping, or at least their genius is Chinese. They've leapt into this new generation of cyber communications and taking advantage of it for every aspect of business. But they want to control it. They're control freaks. If you're willing to deal in a control freak environment, have at it.
Okay. The other thing that you mentioned was the election, and Biden, Vice President Biden, has been on record as calling Xi a thug. So I don't think that the relationship would be a whole lot different. But what do you think if there was an administration change? How would that change the relationship?
I don't think it would change a lot. Democrats tend to be more protectionist than Republicans. Hard to believe these days because everybody seems to be a protectionist. I'm a free trader, but there are limits as to abusing the system. I do feel that we were naive in the Clinton administration, Charlene and I, and those who helped Charlene, in assuming that they would play by the rules. So I confess to that. We were just living in a different world back then. But I don't think it's going to change. And the one thing President Clinton taught me when I did the Agreement of Principle with Vietnam, later signed by George W. Bush, but it took us a long time to get it done, is I remember him calling me into the office and saying, Richard, that was the easy part. Negotiating with Congress is much more difficult than China or Vietnam or anybody else. And we were a Democratic administration, even though we followed the footsteps of George H.W. Bush in terms of opening up the system, which I'm proud of. But we found that our own party, the Democratic Party, used to be my party, I'm now apolitical since I joined the Fed, was even more protectionist than the Republican Party. Even more protectionist than what President Trump talks about, who's protectionist. He's a nationalist. So I don't think it'll be much changed. And he'll have to be especially sensitive given his son's involvement there. So he may have to lean even further, harder. My guess is his mode of expression, though, will be a little bit more diplomatic, but that's easily said.
Yeah, well, maybe a low bar. We're sitting in Texas. We can't leave without at least talking a little bit about the fossil fuels business, oil and gas industry. What are your macro views on the demand side of the oil price equation?
Well, I'm sure members of the board of Exxon are asking the same question, by the way. Even in Texas, as I understand it, even at some points, 15% of our energy is generated by wind. All you have to do is drive around Amarillo and up around Wichita Falls, and you'll see a jillion windmills, and we seem to be good at that. We're the windiest state, and we've captured more of that energy than anybody else. California's way behind us. But I think it's going to be pretty hard to replace fossil fuels. We are blessed with the Permian Basin, God's greatest gift to America and to Texas and parts of New Mexico. And I don't think that's going to go away. Now, when you have a crestfallen demand, as we've seen, people don't drive their cars, they don't get on airplanes, they don't use avgas, et cetera. And when you've had a pretty mild summer and a mild fall, even heating oil is cheap because demand is suppressed. So as demand picks up here, unless we have a sudden replacement, which I don't foresee for quite some years, probably for the rest of my life. I'm only 71, so let's say the next 29 years. I still think fossil fuels will be of value. And also our chemicals business is so driven by natural gas in the United States, unlike the Europeans, that we are, I think, in a very good position there. So, however, price at $38 are hard. And there's going to be enormous structural change in the field, even in the Permian, which is the most prolific of all fields and which we're lucky to have here in Texas.
Do you expect a sea change in regulation of the oil and gas industry if there was to be an administration change?
It sounds like it, yep. They've got more of a green energy thrust. And from what I've heard of the pronouncements so far, particularly from if Kamala Harris gets elected, as she said in her administration the other day, I would imagine there'll be some more and more penalties on the oil and gas industry. So I think one can plan on that. Every corporation I know, every CFO I know, whether they're operating here or in another country, are planning on tax increases. Governments are desperate for revenue, whether it's the Saudis or the Americans or the French or whoever it may be. So I think that's something boards have to plan for, CFOs have to plan for. And again, as you plan, take advantage of these low interest rates and the very tight spreads with less than investment rate credit. I'd exploit that right now, as long as you can manage your debt load. As you know, I'm on the board of AT&T. We have a little bit of debt at that company, but I think John Stevens has been managing it brilliantly.
one of the criticisms we got here, I'll say criticism generally of boards, is that this viewer believes that they're, the common thing about they're too chummy, it's too, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, not enough independent thinking, nothing done, really no hard decisions made until, the fan gets hit. So what is your response to that? I mean, I believe there's been a change in that over the last year. What do you say to that?
Well, I think ISS and others have forced some of those changes. There are also, many boards have tenure limits. I'll be 72 in March of next year, and I will rotate after that in the spring off the boards of AT&T and PepsiCo. I don't find either of those boards to be chummy. I think they're very active boards. And if you look at, for example, and I think this is particularly for the great law firm of Baker Botts, if you look at how we took on the President of the United States with the Warner deal to uphold the rule of law as it was being practiced and won that case, we had a lot of heated discussions about that. And yes, we ended up all rowing in the same direction, but that was a pretty gutsy thing to do. Mm-hmm. And if we were just all worried about our resumes and our safety and all this kind of stuff, I'm talking about our job security, or at least our resume security, we wouldn't have taken that, we wouldn't have encouraged Randall Stephenson to take that on. So I don't consider either of those boards chummy. The case of Tenet Healthcare that I'm privileged to be on the board of, that's a very difficult hospital operation to operate, particularly in the age of COVID. We have really challenging discussions with Ron, the CEO, Ron Rittermeyer, who's a tough guy. He's a good tugboat captain. And no, I don't see chumminess on the boards that I serve on. And I think these shareholder services are also putting pressure on folks to, stay on the balls of their feet. And particularly now, changing the complexion of different boards by bringing in underrepresented groups, I think will add further dynamism to these boards. And they're not going to be able to bring in people that are just going to slip right in and feel comfortable with the existing culture because they want to change that culture. So I think changes are afoot, and I think they're healthy.
What about on the communication front? Do you think that the communication between management teams and boards is better now? Do you complain about that at all?
No, I think the boards that I serve on demand transparency. Mm-hmm. And in fact, increasingly, those boards, these are just my own experiences on my 3 boards. In terms of the preparation for the board meeting, the pre-reads have gotten longer and longer, and the board meetings consist of challenging management, asking questions, getting clarification. There's been a real shift at PepsiCo because of the new leadership there under Ramon Laguarta. And same thing at AT&T under Randall, and now we're transitioning to John Stankey. Both boards insisted that we get all the pre-reads done, and we should have discussions at the board meeting. It's not just getting people to stand up and sell you that they're doing the right thing in the management core. Same thing at Tenet, by the way. So, yeah, I think there are changes, and I think, again, the shareholder services may sometimes push a little bit too aggressively, mm-hmm. but I think they've been of constructive value.
So you've been through, and you're in the midst of some succession planning, which is really difficult for public corporations. Mm-hmm. What's your advice to directors on succession planning and actual succession? Well,
you have to look very broadly. I think you owe it to your shareholders to make sure you consider a broad, qualified panoply of candidates. It is hard to move into a big corporation. We looked everywhere, and then we decided on John Stankey because he was the one who was running Warner, which is the new addition here. The content side, we have all the pipes and stuff, but getting that content through and changing the structure of the company to incorporate that and lead into the future. But he also had the right commanding presence to handle it. He knows more about telecom than anybody that I know. But we did look very broadly. And then the same would be said for PepsiCo when we went and decided finally on Ramon. We looked across the board. I think you have to look very broadly here. It's not just CYA, by the way. You owe it to your shareholders to get that done. So I think the headhunters are of value, but of limited value, because they throw out the same names over and over again. And you do have to use the board, you guys, to think through who else may be available and what their qualities are and qualifications, and whether or not they might be appropriate to look at. And then the really difficult part here is containing the information. Because you go out and look too openly, then you can spread rumors or stories that may not appeal to the shareholders. You have to be very careful about this process. I've learned a lot by watching in these three corporations, because all three of them went through transitions.
Yeah.
And you have to have a very tight lip.
Let me, another one, I'm going to go back to China here, to one of our
Or as the president would call it, China.
Do you foresee a change in the reliance on or the reliability of China in supply chains for U.S. companies?
Well, you've already seen people move away as much as possible, pick up Vietnam, pick up Mexico to the extent they can, some Eastern Europeans. And I think the biggest problem with China was they priced themselves out of the labor market. Remember, when the wall came down, this was a huge source of cheap labor, drove down prices. The Indians, by the way, which we should never neglect in this process, followed one of the worst bureaucratic structures in the world, and we were flooded with cheap labor. Well, the Chinese outpriced themselves in many of the markets, so that's already begun to take place. The one thing I would just add about China, in terms of whomever is elected president, you have to remember, their mortal enemy is not the United States. It's South Korea and Japan. It's a tripartite hatred society. It's steeped in antiquity. The same with the Vietnamese. When we were there in 1979, they were fighting a hot war with Vietnam. And I remember Spig Brzezinski got Deng Xiaoping to stop it just the few days that we were in Beijing, then they went back at it. So those four countries, those three countries, in addition to Taiwan and India, who has this historical antipathy with China, we need to button up those relationships, because Japan's our aircraft carrier in the Pacific. We can always look to the Vietnamese to be a little bit of a irritant to the Chinese. The South Koreans and the Japanese were able to overcome what economists call the middle income trap just through the sweat of their brow. China's trying to do that now to show that they're better. So I would use our diplomacy very forcefully in that part of the country, part of the world, and make sure we have very strong relations. The new Prime Minister of Japan, who just succeeded Abe, who was a good friend of the United States, with the Chinese Communist Party and the way they like to position themselves against the Chinese, the Vietnamese Communist Party. And also, of course, we're going to have to make clear after Hong Kong that we will uphold our agreements with Taiwan. That's a tough one. I wonder what either president would do if the Chinese went across the straits for Taiwan. Would we be willing to sacrifice American young lives? And if we didn't, forget about Japan, forget about South Korea, forget about India, forget about Europe. And no one would have faith in the United States anymore. The Chinese know this. So they're going to be playing a prickly game.
Similar question, the folks in the Middle East and the south side of the Arabian Gulf are asking about our willingness to intervene in Iran.
That's correct. Well, we have the Israelis to help us.
Yeah, maybe a different deal. So I'm going to read you another one here. Mexico. Can you comment on the near and medium term in Latin America and other emerging and frontier markets from the general economic and cross-border investment standpoints?
Yeah, I grew up in Mexico. I love the country. I didn't speak English till I was 11. Primary school was all in Mexico City schools. Tough nuns, by the way, they have in Mexico. But I'll separate Mexico from the rest of Latin America. The rest of Latin America is a mess. Venezuela, we all know about. Brazil is struggling under its president. They have a horrible COVID problem. And the centrals are topsy-turvy, dictator-type leadership and weak. Typically, Colombia does fairly well, and they're still doing fairly well somehow through all the FARC and everything else that they have to deal with. The Peruvians have fallen from grace, and even the Chileans have fallen from grace, and they were the Switzerland of Latin America. So I would say south of the isthmus, it's a mess. And I think that's going to be a very difficult part of the world to operate in and become less and less significant. Plus, they're struggling under enormously bad fiscal policy and huge dollar debt loads, which is very hard to deal with. A lot of them issued century bonds. Mexico issued century bonds, for example, in dollars and in euros as well as pesos. Mexico's are relative to our economy as the Turkey on our southern border. We have to be very careful. It is riddled with crime, and yet these are productive, hardworking people. And we see that in the auto business, particularly in the northern border area. And we need to have a solid Mexico for our own safety in this country. We don't want a Turkey on our southern border. By the way, I don't worry about the northern border because I can listen to Gordon Lightfoot all day long and it puts me to sleep, so I'm not worried about Canada.
Everybody likes Canadians.
Hey. Now, we have a different type of president in Mexico, and we don't know if he's going to work or not. And we also know that he's given to his own form of corruption and his fantasies of, instead of bullets, we're going to give him hugs. But I think he's getting wiser. He's employing the military now. When they tried to assassinate the chief of police in Mexico City, I think that was Mexico City has been sacrosanct to this date. So hopefully he'll pull up his socks and be a little bit more challenging to the bad elements of Mexico. But they are suffering economically speaking. Part of that has to do because they depend on their northern neighbor, the United States. And I got my fingers crossed for Mexico, but I'm skeptical under this president if it's going to work. He only has a 6-year term. He's got, 4 years left, I believe, or maybe 5, 4.5. We'll have to see what damage he does in the interim.
What about the immigration issue there?
Well, I'm the son of immigrants. We all come from immigrant stock, unless we're Native American. It's what makes our country great. People emphasize that. We can't take everybody. And I think we should have a legal form of immigration that's enforceable and brings in the best talent. On that subject, by the way, those of us that are fortunate to be university educated, we bring to our great universities, whether it's UT or Rice or my alma mater at Harvard or Stanford or wherever it may be, the best brains in the world. And then we don't let them stay. I mean, very few. It's like drilling a well, bringing all those resources up to the surface of the earth, and then giving it away to the rest of the world. So we have to be mindful of the Chinese student body. We know that they come to purloin things and have to go back with their 8 presentations that they have to make when they return home. The most prized is intellectual property that they can take. But there's a lot that want to stay here. And look at our high-tech industry. Look at the Indian Americans that have done so well, or the Russian Americans that have done so well. So I think we have to figure out a way to capture the best minds in the world and keep them here, and not just sort of discard them after we've given them the benefit of our educational system. But we can't take everybody, and that's a really tough one. President Obama and President Clinton, who I served, also talked about securing the southern border. And almost not as eloquent as President Trump has done it, but they said basically the same things.
Well, yeah.
And they also talked about a wall. So I do think we can't take everybody. We have to figure out a rational system for getting the best that will contribute to our country and make it even greater than it is.
I think Barbara Jordan in her panel for President Clinton said, we need to change the system to make sure we're bringing in people that can add to our economy and not so family-based.
She was a remarkable woman, by the way. Couldn't help but fall in love with Barbara Jordan.
Let's see. So one last, and we may have really touched on this. Let's see. We're rightly focused in Texas on the idea of peak oil, but do you think we have reached a point of peak trust in our society and institutions?
It would appear. I do worry about that. We have both on the right and the left challenges to norms. Look at even little things like the proliferation of profanity in day-to-day conversations or in restaurants. And so it really, I'm old-fashioned because I'm old, but I do think we have to remember what binds this country together and stop emphasizing what tears it apart. I think social media plays a big role here. If you go to Apple News in the morning, they just emphasize a person got shot here or 2 people got shot there. It's almost like the Wild West again opened up. And I do worry about, I was thinking the other day, Abe Rosenthal was the great editor of the New York Times. On his gravestone, you know what's printed? Job was to keep the newspaper straight. What if he came back today? It's opinionated, it doesn't report the news. Same can be said for almost any other news
Yeah,
outlet.
anybody.
So I do think that exacerbates the situation, but that's a great way to phrase the question. We sort of have peaked on civility and are in decline. I hope we can find leadership, not just in the presidency, across the board, in the corporate community as well, to help set standards. And I'll give you a good example of that, and forgive me for doing this. Randall Stephenson set a great example on race relations with that town hall meeting and what he's done since as he's morphing out of his position at AT&T. That's the kind of leadership we're going to have to turn to corporations to do, because we're not going to have it in the body politic.
Yeah.
Whether it's Chuck Schumer or Donald Trump, their behavior is abhorrent. And we need to have a restoration of civility. And I want to conclude, by the way, by thanking you for having Jim Baker at your firm, one of the great leaders. You talk about a distinguished individual. I think I mentioned to you that we shared a hunting cabin once, and we went elk hunting together. I luckily had shot the first elk, even though he's a much better shot. But he won the snoring contest in our in our cabin. He can snore like nobody else. Even that he does extremely well.
Well, we
And
appreciate
I'm honored
you
to be here.
succeeding him in this.
Well, I'll never succeed him, but I'm happy to be a small shoe in his footprint.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
And with that, I guess we're going to take a break. Is somebody? Okay, a 10-minute break? All right, thank you.
All right.